Good day, everyone, and welcome to Part 3 of the DOE Fuel Cell Technologies Office HydroGEN webinar series. In today's installment, we'll discuss the HydroGEN Consortium's Solar Thermochemical, or STCH, capabilities. My name is Chris Worth, and I am the organizer for this meeting. We'll begin shortly, but first I have a few housekeeping items to tell you about. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording, along with the slides, will be posted to our EERE website in about 10 days. We will send out an email to attendees once those are posted to the site. Next slide, please. All attendees will be on mute throughout the webinar, so please submit your questions via the questions box that you should see on your webinar panel. Tony, will you go to the next slide there for me?
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Again, all the attendees will be on mute throughout the webinar, so please submit your questions via the question box that you should see on your webinar panel. We will cover those questions during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please, Tony. With that, I would like to introduce our DOE host, Ben Quar, joining us from the Department of Energy headquarters in Washington, D.C. Ben is a fellow supporting the Hydrogen Production and Delivery Program within the Fuel Cell Technologies Office. Good afternoon, Ben. Take it away.
Great. Thanks for the intro, Chris. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the third and final webinar describing the capabilities in the Fuel Cell Technologies Office HydroGEN Consortium. This webinar, as Chris mentioned, will focus on the capabilities relevant to solar thermochemical water splitting, also known as STCH. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Anthony McDaniel with us to help describe the opportunities and capabilities for STCH materials research and development within the consortium. Dr. McDaniel is a staff scientist at Sandia National Lab and a program lead for FCTO-funded research focused on hydrogen production pathways from concentrated solar power. Dr. McDaniel is on the steering committee for HydroGEN and has 20 years of experience conducting research in functional materials and more recently their application to technologies for energy storage and conversion. He has co-authored more than 60 publications in the fields of thermochemical gas splitting, heterogeneous catalysis, solid-state chemical sensing, electrochemistry, and atmospheric chemistry. His current interests are focused on thermochemistry and electrochemistry of materials critical to developing sustainable energy technologies. Tony, thanks for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben and the Department of Energy for giving me the opportunity to talk about the consortium for STCH. And so there's a little bit of background on what these EMNs are that I'll just kind of quickly go through. The idea is to bring together and leverage laboratory investments or DOE investments in laboratory capabilities. And so we've assembled for this consortium and for STCH in particular these world-class capabilities within the laboratories, and then there's a framework with which the external collaborators through full awards can actually interact with the laboratories. And so that's kind of summarized in these 4 points here. The framework, again, of the engagement looks like this, where you have a series of national laboratories. Here we have 6, and within those laboratories there are capabilities unique to those laboratories, and then engagement with those capabilities is kind of managed through not only full awards, but also through a steering committee and kind of the hierarchy you see here. The 6 laboratories that we have for HydroGEN are NREL, Berkeley Lab, Sandia National Labs, Idaho, Lawrence Livermore, and Savannah River. And the folks you see on this page are basically the single points of contact or entries into those laboratories. The idea of this EMN was fostered and pretty much set into concrete at this workshop that was hosted by DOE back in April. And so the objective of this EMN is obviously to bring to market these advanced water splitting concepts that are encompassed in either advanced electrolysis, photoelectrochemistry, or STCH into the commercial realm, and doing so by meeting these cost targets for ultimately these cost targets for hydrogen. So this particular consortium, HydroGEN, invests in 3 technology areas. They're listed here, and this talk is part 3 of 3, where we'll talk specifically about the capabilities within this consortium for solar thermochemical pathways. And with me are Hyun Din and Hector Mercado from NREL and Savannah River, respectively. So I guess at the cartoon level, the approaches to solar thermochemical splitting of water are stitch are kind of just shown here. The DOE investment in stitch and the hybrid stitch process have kind of migrated towards these two-step cycles. And so a lot of the capabilities that you'll see that I talk about today are basically results of that investment. And so while there are lots and lots of other thermochemical cycles and hybrid cycles that have been proposed, the particular investment in DOE and stitch has been limited to these two cycles. And so it's natural that the capabilities we'll talk about today represent that investment. But on one half, when we do pure thermochemistry, we look into these simple two-step reactions that net the third, that's on the left there, where you essentially defect a metal oxide by exposing it to high temperature process heat gotten by concentrated solar power. The oxygen will spontaneously come out of the oxide or metal oxide. That's what we call defecting it. And then you, in the second half of the cycle, you then expose that defected oxide to steam and you make hydrogen. And that's what's represented in those three reactions on the left. Here, the metal cation is a redox active species or element in this cycle. The other hybrid cycle, shown on the right, involves a combination of thermochemistry and electrochemistry. So there's a thermochemical part where you do the reduction of now the element in this cycle with sulfur, shown on the right there, and then you can use an electrolytic process to produce the hydrogen. And so I'll be talking about capabilities that are been built up within the consortium that support both of these technologies. If I just focus on the MOX cycle, the metal oxide cycle, these are typical conditions and system metrics that we impose on this process, and they're pretty extreme. To get these oxides, these non-volatile metal oxides, to spontaneously to emit oxygen, you have to expose them to relatively high process temperatures. So that's done by a concentrated solar power system shown there on the right, an array of mirrors and whatnot that could then essentially take the image of the sun and multiply it many thousands of times so that you can generate this really high temperature process heat. You put it in a thermochemical environment where, like I said, the oxygen will come out of the solid spontaneously, and then you take it off sun, you lower the temperature and expose it to steam. And these, you can imagine, there are lots of challenges, not only on the reactor side of this process, but also on the material side. And while the EMN is specifically focused on finding materials that can do this process in a reliable and durable way, there are plenty of challenges on the reactor side that can also be addressed with some of the tools that are available to the consortium. And you'll see that in the later part of the talk when we talk about the systems analysis capabilities and kind of the activity and that involves in the modeling and the proposed, let's say, reactor designs that you could test if you had materials, and more importantly, if you had known properties of these materials. So their main motivation for the EMN, this is a simple waterfall chart that shows some cost projections using the H2A tool on what it would take to ultimately achieve the DOE cost targets. And it's clear that at least in the early part of the technology development, if you look at the second bar over that we talk about the reaction extent of the material, there are some significant gains that can be made in cost reductions if you can find these redox active materials that have high utilization, high capacity, and whatnot. So that's principally the focus of the DOE investment thus far for the material side, and those are the capabilities that will be made available to successful awardees for the consortium. So the way the resource nodes is what they're called, and the node is essentially comprised of a tool, a technique, and a specific expertise at a lab. They're kind of categorized into three bins. They're category 1 nodes that are basically fully developed and accessible and ready to use and have been essentially demonstrated for stitch projects. The category 2 nodes may require some development and additional investment to make them relevant to the stitch problem or the stitch materials problem, and then the category 3s are maybe they require a significant development for stitch and would require maybe a longer-term commitment from either a funding agency or even a full respondent to help develop the third category into something more like a category 1 or 2. But we categorize these nodes, we surveyed the laboratories, we categorize these nodes, and so when you go to the the H2 Awesome website and you start selecting potential tools to use there. Keep in mind that you want to pay attention to their basically node readiness first for Stitch. And so 1 would be the most directly ready and available, 2 next, and so on. Within the consortium we have, I think there are 88 resource nodes to span the 3 technology areas in this consortium. 40 of those can be used or applied to the Stitch materials problem. And so I've classified them here. I'll run through each of these 4 areas and demonstrators and discuss the tools that we have available for analysis, characterization, computation, and also the synthesis and process. So I'll start with an idea of how maybe these nodes might be utilized. You can imagine a project that could pull on more than one node, and it's probably encouraged that they do. There's a great amount of computational capability in this EMN that range from atomistic, kind of generating atomistic models and understanding of materials all the way up through multi-physics and multi-scale models. You could potentially use some of the computational tools to guide your choices on potential synthesis of materials or what their chemical composition might look like. We certainly also have a really strong strength and capability in the characterization of these materials. And so this is just a general idea or mapping of how a particular project, wherever a successful awardee kind of jumps in, whether it's in proposing a material of their own or ideas on how to make a material or even ideas on how that material might behave, you could jump in and access a characterization tool or even a computational tool. And of course, all of this rests upon this analysis and process a large-scale base or platforming. And so you'll see we have within this EMN access to very impressive facilities for concentrated solar power, unique in the U.S. And that is where you can really test your ideas at scale, for instance. And then also we also have access to analysis tools that will enable you to further your projections of the successfulness of your idea and proposed technology. So starting with characterization capabilities, they're kind of color-coded here. Again, going to Category 1, Category 2, Category 3. The orange kind of box on the left lists 5 of the Category 1 nodes for characterization, and I'll step through a few of those, not all of them, just to give you an example of what you might expect from these particular nodes. And then there are other capabilities that I won't talk about, but they're certainly worth looking into. And the way you do that is to essentially click on the link on the H2 Awesome website under the capabilities. Every time a link is pressed, it directs you to a PDF file that has a fairly lengthy description, maybe a few pages of what the node is capable of doing, along with references that you can then go read and see if that particular node is right for you. And while I won't actually have time to talk about all of these nodes, I'm picking just a few to highlight some of the expectations you might have for the information they can provide and how you might collaborate with that particular resource node. I would encourage you to look at all of them in greater detail. So the first is this high temperature in situ X-ray diffraction, time of flight SIMS, and thermal gravimetric analysis. The nature of these metal oxides, these non-volatile metal oxides, is that you put them under some extreme conditions where the act of defecting them causes crystallographic changes in their structure. And that act in and of itself, it's how you actually store the solar energy within that crystal. At that exact moment when you defect is when you actually store the energy in that crystal. But that transformation that crystal undergoes and being able to watch it in real time has an incredible benefit for understanding how the material behaves and maybe even formulating new ideas on how you might want to change material composition or electronic structure or whatnot to promote something that's more advantageous for the particular process you're interested in. So here's a method of doing that. This is a high temperature in situ X-ray diffraction technique where it has an environmental cell that can be put into conditions of pressure and temperature that are very similar to, if not identical to, what you'd expect to find on either the oxidation side or the reduction side of this two-step cycle. And you can watch things that for instance, the lattice parameter of the material might change, and you can actually look to see if phases are coming in and out. So that's a very useful and powerful piece of information. I'll talk about another node that uses X-rays in a different way that can give you equally powerful and useful information. But nonetheless, this is a technique that that I would imagine would be highly sought after if you're dealing with these metal oxide cycles. When you take this information then and couple it with gravimetry or even some isotope studies of oxygen exchange in these materials, you can really put together a very complete picture on what's happening at least at the microscopic level within these solids. They undergo these transformations of absorbing and desorbing oxygen. One of the other nodes that we have that are relevant to, again, testing materials under extreme conditions is this laser heated stagnation flow reactor. It's just here it's an environment where you can expose the material to extremes of thermal gradients, heating rates of hundreds of degrees per second, and in conditions again that are like the oxidation or the reduction cycle. And you can get information that's relevant to the chemical transformations that are occurring within the solid. But here you're looking at essentially the gases that come out of this reactor as a means to probe what's actually happening within the material. Now for the hybrid cycle, basically the reduction reaction occurs in conditions that are high temperature and it's at a gas-solid interface and over catalysts, and so that we haven't talked much about. But the low temperature part of that process, which is this electrochemical oxidation of the sulfur, that is done in an electrolytic system, and there's a capability here that will allow you to do catalyst testing, membrane testing in a pressurized button cell that's been equipped to handle the conditions of the acidic conditions essentially that exist within that particular step of the cycle. It's a pretty challenging environment. This is an investment that's been realized over the last several years, and again, it's for testing the electrolytic part of that other cycle. So that's available. To conclude, kind of the characterization part. Here's a great approach that uses essentially synchrotron-based X-rays. Here again for the metal oxides, and it could also be used if you're thinking about the catalysts that might be used in the high temperature reduction of the sulfur, or even the catalytic membranes that are used in the electrolytic step for the hybrid cycle. And this is getting it using synchrotron or tunable X-rays to look at basically the structure property relationships of matter of certain elements. And so now, while this particular node has been proven and used in the PEC community, and maybe even in the low temperature electrolysis, there may be ways to adapt this to essentially work with the thermochemistry that we're interested in, because the elements are the elements, and if we can put them in the same condition as we'd expect, get useful information out of them, you can still do the X-ray absorption, you could do the ambient pressure XPS, and then apply theory to the understanding of that information, and really learn a lot about the real structure, electronic structure and the manipulation of that electronic structure as it goes through these cycles. That could be proved very useful, especially in deriving, let's say, design rules for these materials. How you'd expect them. Well, if you can understand them at this level, and then have theory that helps you further kind of the design rule, or even provide you with inspiration for making or modifying your materials, this is kind of where we'd expect to see this approach applied. So computational capabilities are quite vast in this particular EMN. Several laboratories are world-renowned for multi-physics models, ab initio models, and whatnot. So here's just a few. Here's the list that are stitch ready and stitch capable. And I'll go through a few examples from the atomistic up that would could potentially inspire folks to collaborate with these particular resources. First principles theory is always, it's an expertise within several of the laboratories in this consortium. Here's an example of digging into, again, for these oxides, what exactly is happening at the electronic structure level during the defecting of these materials, and how you might predict their behavior, and in fact, even how to, if you can actually predict the thermodynamics of a material composition without ever having to test them. This is a great power that we have in this EMN, and we certainly like to exercise it on these materials specifically, and the expertise is here. Again, the hope would be is to do, theory does a great job of explaining an observation you might have, but then taking it to the next level of actually producing information that would then allow you to formulate a new design rule or even a new compound based on your theoretical understanding. That would be a great place to get to for these particular materials. Taking a step up, it's always, I imagine that there's a lot of interest in people wanting to propose new material systems for these stitch processes. And the question is, well, how do I know whether they're good, bad, or indifferent? And so there's a platform here that would allow you, if you're able to formulate a very detailed thermodynamic model of the material itself, it can be straightforwardly plugged into basically a thermodynamic model of the process, and show at least predict an expected theoretical efficiency for the behavior of that material. And so as we get more and more down the road of trying to benchmark and come to consensus on how to evaluate these materials on kind of a level playing field, a tool like this could be useful for doing that, just doing that comparison between several different materials that have been proposed, as long as a thermodynamic model can be produced for the material behavior. Taking a step up from that, there are folks that have a material in mind or a material in hand, and they're just wanting to know how that may behave in these cycles, these thermochemical cycles at scale. There are multi-physics and multi-scale computational capabilities within the consortium that will allow you to explore that, even explore particular reactor designs or ideas you have at the reactor component level. So here's an example of one where this is a fully coupled reactor that has material in it. It has radiative transfer, heat transfer in it, and then it's providing what you might expect the behavior of material to do, and it's doing it all computationally. So this is a great power because it clearly makes it easy to test ideas and materials in particular without going to the expense of actually constructing prototypes for reactors, which can be quite expensive, especially these types of systems. Taking a step up from that, of course, now you've got your understanding of your material, you've kind of got a component level understanding of how it might behave, and then you're really curious to know how will it actually behave in a large plant. And so we have a tool to help do that as well, to address that particular question is, will my material be effective at a scale that's 100 metric ton hydrogen a day plant? And so there's a tool for that. Another thing that we're bringing to this, to making available to the potential full awardees, is the idea of, you have all these predictive capabilities, and in reality, no model is a perfect representation of nature. There's always assumptions and simplifications that are made, and this tool and feature allows you to test the uncertainty within those assumptions that are made. Whatever the simplifications that are made in the model, there's always going to be an uncertainty around it, and there are critical parameters within models. And so this is a very rigorous statistical approach to allow you to address, what is the impact of what I don't know about my system, or the simplifications that I've made. And so I'm looking forward really to exercising this on a lot of, not just the scaled models that we've talked about here, the multi-scale models that we've talked about here, but also you can use this tool for looking at the economic analysis, sensitivity analysis, the projection of future costs, as well as even in these models that are used to try to understand or predict material performance at the thermodynamic level, you could again address or try to assess what are the impacts of the things that you don't know to its ultimate prediction. So this will be something I think the respondents will find quite useful. Getting to our synthesis and process capabilities, as I mentioned earlier, the lists 1 through 4 in the orange box in red are actually the CSP testing facilities, and they're really quite impressive. And then as we take a step away from just what the chemical formulation of the material might look like, basically it's stoichiometry, there are some ideas on not only how you would further synthesize, maybe even or engineer materials for the reactors themselves, which are worth exploring. And then again, we're getting back to the materials that are required for process scale, like membrane separators and whatnot. So we have several different capabilities within this space for that. Let's see, this is a capability that I think is interesting. It's not yet been applied to the stitch case. It's mainly for high temperature electrolysis, but it shows some relevant ideas and thinking for doing combinatorial chemistry of material discovery. That's kind of lacking in our field today. And so there are methods that are available in this particular node that are amenable, even though they haven't been directly applied to the solar thermochemical materials case. It turns out that it's for trying to derive, basically, in a combinatorial way, what these solid oxide or complex oxides look like for electrodes for high temperature electrolysis. But the materials themselves are quite similar in composition and function sometimes. And so this is a tool that maybe with a little bit of development could lead towards a true combinatorial high throughput approach on the experiment side, not necessarily the atomistic modeling side, that could develop stitch material, but so far it's been applied only to the high temperature electrodes, high temperature electrolysis electrode chemistry. This is an interesting tool we have for, in this field, there's a movement for using engineered structures instead of just, let's say, powders or basically impregnated monoliths, where you can build these really elaborate structures out of your active material, and they can be designed for light trapping, they can be designed for heat transfer, optimized heat transfer and whatnot, because the first part of this process is coupling high flux radiation into the actual active material itself, and that in and of itself is challenging. And so this idea that's built up on additive manufacturing, where you could conceive of structures that would then not only help you out, once you have material chemistries that you're confident in, you could then try to further optimize the structure through a morphological or mechanical means by building up these kinds of active or engineered materials through this capability. And then the important part of the hybrid process, of course, are the separation membranes, the environment with which you're basically oxidizing the sulfuric acid is quite extreme, and so being able to do that and improve the properties of those membranes. So for proton transport and durability, lowering the overpotential, of course, these are always important things. We have a means to explore some kind of advanced polymer membrane sciences that apply both not only to the electrolytic step in the hybrid process, but also even within the consortium, we have a low temperature electrolysis capability, which this can be applied to. And then now we get to these really cool looking facilities. There are several of them, well, two mainly, where when we talk about harvesting and collecting the light, these are large facilities. Usually they operate on taking images of the sun and casting them into a single place using focused optics, mirrors principally. And so here's one where there's a solar furnace that is capable of basically putting a scaled system or upscaled system on sun and being able to characterize its behavior. So this is one of two facilities we have for that. The other is the National Solar Thermal Test Facility, where if you really have some grand ideas about upscaling to megawatts, your idea, it'd be possible to do that here. There's a power tower, a 6 megawatt power tower located at the facility, and then there's also a solar furnace. And then at this facility, we also have a high flux solar simulator. So you have the option of going on sun for some of your projects, and/or if you needed access to simulated solar light 24/7 as opposed to whenever the sun was out, then you could do that here too. So the final bank of capabilities we have are based on analysis. Most, if not all, of the projects will utilize these nodes in one way, shape, or form. It's one method that the Department of Energy expects you to demonstrate the efficacy of your idea. You have to do a projection of the cost of that. And so there are some tools that can help you along with that. In addition to H2A, there are several other tools and methods that when you collaborate with the staff scientists that kind of operate these, develop these codes and methods, you could essentially ask and probe questions about, is my technology commercially viable? or what would it take to get it there? So there are several capabilities in-house or in this consortium that could help answer those questions, from what does the solar resource look like to what are the costs of at the component level, and what is it ultimately what's going to be the cost of hydrogen at the system level. There's another TEA analysis method that's based in flow sheets development, and this tool is principally used for the hybrid cycle, but it seems it can be amenable to any proposed process that you might conceive of that would essentially benefit. Again, if it's materials we're looking at or processes we're looking at, what's an optimal way of organizing all these components to make them ultimately not only efficient, realizable, but also to give you the expected or the predicted behavior of it, and can you ultimately meet the cost target for hydrogen, which is pretty stringent. With that, I'll close. This is again the third seminar we've had in this series. The other two eventually, or if not already, are available to view online, and I think slides may be available if there are any further questions that either aren't answered here or addressed in the hour that we have. And with that, I'll open the floor up to questions.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Yes, as Tony mentioned, we're taking questions now. We have plenty of time for questions. Feel free to type them in the questions box. We also have Hyun Din and Hector Colon Mercado from Savannah River National Lab, who can also help in answering questions for their specific capabilities. Okay. Yes, we have a question here. For a 50 megaton per day hydrogen production capacity from STCH, how big is the solar field required? Maybe that might require a little bit of calculating, but I don't know if you know that off the top of your head, Tony.
Let's see. So it's not 50 megatons. It's 50 metric tons.
Metric tons, yes.
Megaton's big, but eventually lots and lots of plants put together, you can get to your megaton. But so at a 50 to 100 metric ton of hydrogen per day plant, I would have to go back. We can post the answer if you like. We've done several H2A cases or techno-economic analysis cases on what the field size would look like, how many acres it would take, how many mirrors, how many essentially heliostats, how many towers. So we have that information. I just don't have it at the top of my head.
Okay. Yes, we will follow that up. I believe we'll post that with the slides, as Chris mentioned, at the website. Tony, this is a question I had since none are popping up right now. As far as the National Solar Thermal Testing Facility, it's a pretty large facility. It's a pretty remarkable facility. You mentioned if someone had a material that they would want to test, it can't be as simple as going there and putting it in. Like, what are the requirements? Is there an application typically for using that facility?
That facility is accessed. It's located on Kirtland Air Force Base. So there's some paperwork that has to be done to actually get physical access to that site. But that's not a barrier. It would be depending on what the respondent would propose to do. So at that facility, we actually have a reactor system. This is a cascading pressure reactor system that's actually powered by solar simulated light, where somebody could come to that particular capability, and it's in the list, the CPR2, and they could test their materials under, if it's particulate matter anyway, they could test their materials within that configuration. It would be a matter of just bringing enough material to the site and making the arrangements, of course, to do that work on that facility. Conversely, if somebody had not only a material system that they built up or invested time in doing R&D on, but also a reactor concept, for instance, and they wanted to test it on sun at either this facility or the high flux solar furnace at NREL, they could make arrangements with getting access. They'd have to bring their hardware there, and there'd be there'd be some complications with making sure that whatever they brought would work or fit, for instance, and what it would take to do balance of plant while it was there. But it's certainly doable. It's not, there's nothing that's prohibiting that. Like I said, it's just a matter of pulling on that resource and then starting or engaging in a conversation with the owners of that resource. And an example for the NSTTF, it happens all the time. Private industry comes in, and for a fee they can do and test. And right now, I think a lot of the work that goes on there now is people that are interested in designing heliostats, and they actually go and test their heliostats there. So.
Okay, great, thank you. What is the capacity for the largest unit that could produce hydrogen, or what is the largest capacity that you could test materials on?
I guess I don't. In terms of the amount of material that we'd have that we would test, or the requirement for use in the CPR2, or what? What do you? I guess I don't understand what capacity you're talking about.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure. So if you ask that question, perhaps you could be a little more specific.
Well, I can give an example of a test that's going on right now. There's a technology that Sunshot's investing in that's called a falling particle receiver, and it's being tested on the solar tower. It's being tested on that power tower. You know, has been for the last several months, and that device itself is something like almost 2 stories tall, and it sits on top of the tower, and it has I don't know how many kilograms per second of particles that move through it, but it's a fairly large device with you know, hundreds of pounds of particles that are moving through it. So I mean that's certainly within reason. I don't know that if people have that in mind, but that scale is certainly doable, and then things that are much smaller are also doable.
Great, thank you. I think that answered the question. So there's a comment that the EMN is focused on materials development, but there's also these large facilities, for example, like the NSTTF. The question is, are there examples where testing an entire reactor system can be justified for the project?
That might be better suited to DOE to answer that question. I know the M in EMN stands for materials, and a lot of these capabilities are geared towards that activity. But I don't know. Would Eric want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tony. Can you hear us?
Loud and clear. Yeah.
All right, great. No, it's a good question. As Tony points out, the M in EMN does stand for materials. The focus of all the EMNs are really developing material systems that will ultimately enable our hydrogen production technologies, and for the hydrogen case, to meet our ultimate cost targets. So there's multiple ways to do that. There's multiple potential cost reduction avenues through material research. That's the overarching thrust of the whole EMN, HydroGEN EMN. Again, we will have to wait till the full F comes up with a specific language, but in general, I think it's safe to say that materials research is the major point, but in a practical setting, if we have some capabilities that can reflect the operations of a material or a reactor material system in a real-world operating condition, that gives good justification for that innovation's viability for cost reductions. That's going to be completely consistent with what the EMN research is intended to do. So a lot of words around that. It didn't give you a yes or no answer, but it gave you a context for which you'll come to see will be a unifying theme across the board when we do projects within the CMN.
Thanks, Eric. I have a few more questions here. Tony, do you have an idea of what temperature range I guess, what temperature range we should look at for the stitch process, or what temperature range is usually looked at, or what temperature range or capabilities are capable of looking at?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. Actually, it's really where the materials research is going to help. We in the community, I think, have converged on a practical upper limit, and it's based not necessarily on, well, it's based mainly on what the materials of construction for the device would look like for the high temperature part of the process, the thermal reduction part. So the materials of construction, materials compatibility, and also the cost of doing concentration of light at these temperatures. And I think the community is in agreement that temperatures in excess of 1600 degrees Celsius, that's 1600 degrees Celsius, are probably impractical, unless there's a really breakthrough in some of these other refractory material sciences that would be essentially the materials of construction for these things. What we strive for these non-volatile, two-step non-volatile metal oxide cycles to lower that reduction temperature, and we'd like to get it closer to 1300 degrees Celsius. We know that if you stay just in the pure thermochemical realm, that if you get much colder than that, the thermodynamics kind of work against you for the reoxidation, and so there's some the complex story around that. But we certainly are striving for these redox-active materials to have be able to do the high temperature part of the cycle around 1300 degrees Celsius. And then the low temperature side of the cycle, if you could conceive of a device or a material that was kinetically active at room temperature, for instance, by all means, use it or propose it. But the upper and lower limits, kind of just based on experience, are between 800 degrees Celsius on the low side or so, and around 1400, 1500 degrees Celsius on the high side. Keeping in mind that we'd like to bring down that higher temperature by a few hundred degrees if possible.
Great, thank you.
So I have to, and so Hector can comment on this too. If you're not going to do it purely thermochemically, you're going to actually put an electrochemical step in there. The story changes quite a bit. I mean, it does change quite a lot. And for instance, in their process, they do their sulfur reduction at temperatures where we do our oxidation, essentially around 800 degrees Celsius. Is that correct, Hector?
Yeah, that's correct. It's been looked at between 800 and 900, but that has been looked more in the past due to the heat source design. Now with several other heat sources, we can drop that to temperatures closer to the thermodynamic equilibrium, which is around 600 degrees C. But that, again, that all depends on the composition of your products that are going to be going through the reactor.
And then on your basically water splitting step or hydrogen production step, because it really isn't water splitting, I mean, per se, but the hydrogen production step, that electrolytic step, what is the temperature of that?
That's between 80 degrees C to 120 degrees C.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Hector. Is the TAP system capable of using steam as a reactant?
That's a good question. I was hoping, is there somebody, I don't think we have somebody from INL on the panel. We can answer that question offline. It's my understanding that that TAP system.
Hey, Tony, we have Richard Boardman here in the office with us to address that question for you.
Okay.
Yes, I can answer that. And so the capability as it's currently put together, we do have two temporal analysis products reactors under this node. Neither one of them are currently configured to put steam and full steam into the system. However, we're currently undergoing an activity to do that. That's been something that's come up as a need for this particular system. But currently it's constituted, no. To make that change to be able to put partial pressure steam in there to get some moisture into that, we're looking to do that. So that would be, I would say you should consider that a feasible option.
Very good.
And of course, as you know, as these tap reactors work, you basically can pulse the reactor mixture that's going in there, and it's in a vacuum system. You're trying to operate and look at the catalyst performance as you're down in the Newton diffusion regime, so you're able to study absorption and kinetics. These tap reactors are configured with the mass spectrometer on the back side of this. So those of you who are familiar with the tap reactor know what I'm speaking about there. But again, to answer the question very directly here, currently not able to put the steam in, but we're working to do that because it seems to have been important in a number of these reactor systems.
Great, thank you, Richard. Tony, there's interest in the heliostat you showed. Can you give a ballpark estimate of what it might cost to use that?
Let's see. There's two facilities. I don't know if the question is drive towards getting access to the power tower or just the two solar furnaces that we have, as well as the solar simulator. So solar simulator, in my mind, would be the least expensive to access in terms of the staff time required to use it. It's simply a bank of light bulbs that are configured in a certain way, a special type of light bulb, mind you, and you know. It's a fairly compact system, and it doesn't require much in the way of operating and engineering expertise to run it. So that would be an engagement of a staff person in the project at some small level of FTE, whether it's 0.1 or so. For the accessing either the solar furnaces, I'd have to get back to that. We can get some cost numbers because there are, I think, publicly known price per hour usage fees for the solar furnaces, at least the solar furnaces at the solar furnace at NSTTF. So I know what that value is in what industry has been charged. And then for the other one, I'm sure we can get similar information. So we'll have to respond to that later.
Great, thank you. I have a question. This might be more directed towards Eric. To what extent of techno-economic analysis is expected to be incorporated into a large combinatorial materials project?
Sure, thanks, Ben. Yeah, again, it'll be a similar answer to what I gave before, in the sense that those who are who attended the workshop back in April recognize that the techno-economic and life cycle assessments of our various technologies was used as a framing for viability of the various pathways. And now within that framework, there's pathways for cost reductions through materials innovation to materials research. So the overarching structure of this EMN will be based on those types of analyses. Many of those have been done and published already. We encourage people who are interested in this field to familiarize yourself with what's available, published to date. Look at how within the framework of those economic studies that an innovation could really change the trajectory of the cost. Now, if new analysis is needed to actually make your case, we encourage you to do that. We have a portfolio of tools, as Tony had shown, for you to do that, but we really encourage you to familiarize yourselves with the available techno-economic and life cycle assessments for your technologies, and understand the framework in which you're trying to innovate and reduce cost. And within that, anything that has to do with materials research and development, including materials discovery through combinatorial means, for example, fits well.
Great, thanks, Eric. Tony, as far as the general stitch problem, specifically the heliostat, do you have an idea what the cost status of the heliostat is in the whole stitch problem, and what kind of cost reduction targets are hoped for in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. It turns out that the current, or the baseline case, if you will, from the slide that I'd shown, I believe the costs for heliostats for these central receivers is something on the order of $150 per meter square. And as you can imagine, it's a lot of square meters to build a 50 or 100 metric ton a day plant. So I think the rule of thumb is that the heliostat costs are fully 50% or so of the capital investment. Now, Sunshot has a goal, and this is what we base our future case on, of about $70 per meter squared. And so that's kind of in their purview in funding technologies to reduce the costs of concentrating the solar light. But we take advantage of their future projections of order $70 or $75 per meter squared when we do our outward-looking cases or ultimate cases.
Thank you. I have a question. Can the development of thorium reactors or molten salt reactors be useful in solving the hydrogen production problem, since these might run between 800 and 900 degrees C?
I'm sure this is a question better suited for Hector, because I think originally the hybrid cycle was developed to use heat from Gen 4 reactors. Is that correct, Hector?
Yeah, that's correct. So that was one of the, at the beginning of the development, that was where the 800 to 900 degrees C number was used for the decomposition reactor. And those reactors, the Gen 4, I guess, they were mostly helium cooled. So now with the, I guess, resurgence of the molten salt reactors that operate between 700 to 750 degrees C, you know, those could be used for the decomposition reactor. And in the past, Idaho National Labs has been looking at the catalyst decomposition, the sulfuric acid decomposition reactor. And they have looked at the kinetics and how the kinetics vary with various temperatures with catalysts. So that's kind of a trade-off that you will have to be studied with these reactors that operate at lower temperatures. How your kinetics are affected, and how is that going to affect the balance of plant and ultimately the cost of the hydrogen. And you know, turning this back into the materials network, you know, new catalysts, there's an opportunity for new catalysts to be developed in order to accelerate the kinetics and bring them closer to temperatures that closer to the thermodynamic values.
Hector, very good. This is Richard Boardman, Idaho National Lab 2. What you said is all good, and I'll add to that. Now, there are certainly groups out there developing thorium reactors and molten salt reactors, and they may or may not be able to get that high of temperature, but when they can, you're exactly right. The issue now is to transfer that heat through some sort of system, and materials is certainly involved in getting it to the sulfuric acid splitting part of the process. Now, so there have been capabilities, and they're listed out there as nodes in this particular EMN program, and they look at, for instance, looking at the materials that would carry the heat there and put that into the system, and in a lot of cases it's codification of those materials that would interface with the thorium reactor. So you've kind of got two sides on the materials. The materials as you transfer the heat over from the thorium reactor into the system that's delivering the primary heat, then you get the heat into the reactor that is doing the sulfuric acid, the dissociation. So indeed there are capabilities here to look at those materials and that are relevant to those particular systems. And as well as you mentioned and remarked, also then developing the catalysts which would be able to withstand and operate in those harsh conditions. And so all of those capabilities are in this network.
Great, thank you. And we have a question for Eric. There must be a rumor floating around. Is the FOA coming out December 10th?
Did you say there's a rumor floating around? I'm sorry, did I miss that?
I'm assuming that's the only reason there's a
okay. Yeah, the answer I would give is that we're coming soon, FOA coming soon. We're, you know, it's in all of our best interest to get this through, and we're doing our best to get it out as fast as possible. So keep an eye out for it. Now, I will then springboard into another question that has been asked in several of our other webinars in the series, and I think it's worth repeating. There's been a question from the national laboratories that are not part of the current EMN HydroGEN Consortium. there has been questions whether or not they would be qualified or excluded from applying to projects within the FOA that comes up. Now that language will be very clear in the FOA, but what we have been answering over the past several webinars is that there's no expectation to exclude any of the other national laboratories who are not part of the consortium at this time to actually propose materials innovations that would work with the consortium nodes. So that, I want to clarify that since it's been asked several times, and I just want to make sure the listeners on this call have the same information.
Great. And with that, I don't think we have any more questions. Eric, do you have any final thoughts? Those were your final thoughts.
No, that's fine, Ben. Thanks. It's, yeah, I think we've covered most of the questions. They've been very good questions, some good technical questions. We appreciate the participation, and I do encourage researchers interested in this field to engage vigorously in the near term with the EMN Consortium Concierge and discuss and learn more about the nodes through the website and to the experts that are running these nodes and that are responsible for them. There will be a change in the communications that once the FOA is released, and as again, when the FOA does come out, the language will be very clear about what the limitations on communications will be at that point. But until then, we're very encouraged. We're encouraging you as the researchers to actively engage with our consortium concierge and with our experts and learn about our nodes. And I think that's an exciting time, and I wish you luck with that.
Great. Thanks, Eric. And thank you, Tony, for giving the presentation. And thank you, Hector and Richard, for providing additional insight in the questions. Chris, if you want to wrap up with the website.
Yeah, here. Thank you very much, Ben. Well done on moderating the questions. Thank you to the presenter, Tony, and panelists. Eric, thank you as well. Thank you to the audience for great questions. I think it made for a very lively discussion and informative presentation. You can go to the hydrogenandfuelcells.energy.gov website shown to sign up for our FCTO newsletter and receive news alerts through the newsletter after signing up. You can also find information on upcoming webinars, including registration information, etc. I encourage everyone to go to the associated HydroGEN website where you can find out more about the consortia. And we'll look forward to having everyone back for our next FCTO webinar. Thank you again. Lastly, I will try and have these slides posted probably first thing next week, so I will send out an email to all the attendees when those are posted, and you can go there and download the slides. So take care, everyone, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.